The town of Blackwood doesn't handle silence well. In a place this isolated, where the fog rolls off the river and clings to the asphalt like a second skin, noise is proof of life. The rattle of a pickup truck, the distant bark of a farm dog, the hum of the power lines, these are the heartbeats of the community. When the noise stops, people notice. And for 3 days, the Miller residents at 104 Pinecrest Lane had been dead silent. It started with the mail. Small details, the kind of things you overlook until you are staring at a crime scene photo years later, wondering how everyone missed the signs. Arthur, the mailman who had walked this route for 22 years, was the first to feel the prickle on the back of his neck. The Millers were precise people. David Miller was an accountant, his wife, Sarah, a librarian. They were the type of people who collected their mail at 4:30 in the afternoon, sharp. But on Thursday, the box was full. On Friday, Arthur had to force a catalog in sideways. By Saturday morning, the metal flap wouldn't even close. A stack of envelopes, damp from the morning mist, spilled out onto the perfectly manicured lawn. Arthur stood there on the sidewalk, his breath visible in the cold October air. He looked up at the house. It was a fortress of suburbia, 2 stories, white siding, dark shutters. Secure, impenetrable. But it wasn't the overflowing mailbox that made Arthur's hand tremble as he reached for his phone. It was the stillness. Usually, the Miller's golden retriever, Buster, would be scratching at the front window, barking at the uniform. Today, nothing. The windows were dark eyes staring back at him, void of reflection. No movement behind the curtains, no flickering blue light from a television. Just a heavy, suffocating absence. By noon, the unease had spread from Arthur to the neighbors. It's a specific kind of psychology that takes over a neighborhood when tragedy strikes. First, it's curiosity, then denial, finally, dread. Mrs. Gable from across the street stood on her porch, arms crossed tight over her chest, watching. She told the operator later that she hadn't seen Sarah Miller take the trash out since Tuesday. She hadn't seen the lights change in the kitchen. It was as if the house had simply swallowed them whole. The police cruiser arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon. No sirens, just the crunch of tires on gravel, cutting through the unnatural quiet. Officer Reynolds, a man who had spent 30 years breaking up bar fights and filing noise complaints, stepped out. He adjusted his belt, looking up at the house. To the untrained eye, it looked peaceful. To a cop, a house that quiet in the middle of the day screams only one thing. Reynolds walked up the driveway. He noted the car in the garage, David's sedan. He noted the children's bikes leaning against the side of the porch, untouched. He climbed the steps, the wood creaking under his boots, loud enough to make the gathered neighbors flinch. He knocked. 3 hard, sharp raps. "Police department, welfare check. Is anyone home?" His voice didn't echo. It was absorbed. The house took the sound and gave nothing back. Reynolds moved to the window, cupping his hands against the glass to peer into the living room. It was too dark to see clearly, just shapes and shadows. But he saw enough to know the layout was undisturbed. No overturned chairs, no shattered glass. It was pristine. He tried the handle. Locked. Deadbolted. He walked the perimeter. The back door? Locked. The windows? Latched tight from the inside. Every entry point was sealed. The house was a vault. If the Millers were inside, they had locked the world out. Or something had locked them in. Reynolds returned to the front door. The neighbors were closer now, a semicircle of anxious faces pressing against the police tape that hadn't been hung yet. Reynolds radioed dispatch, his voice low, lacking its usual authority. "Dispatch, this is 1 Charlie 4. No answer at the residence. All points of entry secured. Requesting backup to breach." I have a bad feeling about this one. He didn't wait for backup to try one last thing. He knelt down by the front door, putting his ear to the gap between the wood and the threshold. He expected to hear nothing. Instead, he heard a sound that would haunt his testimony for years to come. From deep inside the sealed, silent house came the faint, rhythmic sound of a dripping tap. Drip, drip, drip. Water. In a house that felt as dry as a bone. Officer Reynolds stood up, drew his baton, and shattered the small window pane next to the lock. He reached in, unlocked the deadbolt, and turned the handle. The door groaned open, exhaling a gust of stale, refrigerated air into the afternoon warmth. And with it came the smell. Not of rot, not of death, but the smell of a Sunday dinner, cold and congealed. The investigation into the Miller family mystery had officially begun. But as Reynolds stepped across the threshold, he didn't realize he wasn't walking into a crime scene. He was walking in to a tomb. Officer Harrison didn't wait for a key. The neighbor's call had been frantic enough to bypass protocol. One kick, solid and practiced, right near the lock. The heavy oak door of the Miller residence gave way with a sickening crack, splinters flying inward like shrapnel. Outside, the town of Blackwood was drowning in a thick, suffocating fog. Inside, the air was still, dead still. Harrison drew his weapon, sweeping the entryway. The hallway was empty. No blood on the pristine beige carpet, no overturned vases, just the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the soft, static hiss of a television set tuned to a dead channel in the living room. He moved toward the dining room, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor. What he found there wasn't a crime scene in the traditional sense. It was a still life painting of domestic normalcy frozen in a terrifying instant. The table was set for 4. The roast beef in the center was carved, the slices resting in a pool of dark, rich gravy. The mashed potatoes were still mounded high in the serving bowl. When Harrison held his hand over the meat, he felt it. Faint, fading heat. They hadn't been gone for days. They hadn't even been gone for an hour. At the head of the table, a fork rested on the edge of a plate, a piece of carrot skewered on the tines halfway to a mouth that was no longer there. A napkin had been dropped on the floor, not thrown, but let go of, as if gravity had simply claimed it. "Police!" Harrison shouted. His voice bounced off the walls, flat and unanswered. He moved room to room, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The back door? Locked, deadbolted from the inside. The windows? Latched tight. The basement? Secure. This is where the cold reality of the case began to settle in. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, no muddy footprints trailing in from the yard. The house was a fortress, sealed tight. If anyone had come in to take the Millers, they had done so without leaving a scratch on the architecture. But then the sensory details began to betray the visual perfection. Harrison holstered his weapon and walked back to the dining room. He took a breath. expecting the savory aroma of the roast beef that sat cooling on the table. But that wasn't what hit him. Underneath the smell of food, there was something else. Sharp, chemical, artificial. It was the smell of industrial-grade bleach. It was faint, woven into the air like a hidden thread, but it was unmistakable. Why would a dining room in the middle of a family dinner smell like a sterilized operating theater? He leaned closer to the table. The tablecloth was dry, the floor was dry, but the scent was fresh. It stung the nostrils. It suggested that someone had been cleaning vigorously. But what do you clean in a room where nothing has been spilled? Harrison looked at the television again. The static danced on the screen, casting flickering, ghostly shadows across the empty chairs. The Miller family hadn't fled. They hadn't fought. They had simply ceased to exist between the appetizer and the main course. And the only witness left behind was that smell. The scent of someone trying to scrub away a sin that hadn't even happened yet, or perhaps a sin that was invisible to the naked eye. The house was locked from the inside, which meant only one thing. Whoever or whatever had interrupted the Miller family dinner was already in the room with them when they sat down to eat. From the outside, 42 Oak Lane looked like the American dream wrapped in pristine vinyl siding, manicured lawn, motion sensor lights, a fortress of domestic bliss standing defiant against the creeping fog of the town. But in my line of work, you learn quickly. If you strip away the paint, you usually find the rot. And the Miller family? They were rotting from the inside out long before they vanished. The timeline doesn't lie, but people do. When we pulled the neighbors and close friends into the interrogation room under the hum of those cheap fluorescent lights, the portrait of a perfect family began to bleed. The first crack appeared with the testimony of Sarah Jenkins, Elena Miller's tennis partner. She didn't want to talk at first. They never do. They want to protect the image of the dead or missing. But eventually, the silence became too heavy to hold. Sarah admitted that Elena had stopped laughing. That was the specific detail. She described Elena constantly checking her phone, not with anticipation, but with dread. A flinch every time a notification pinged. Then came the forensic accounting on Arthur Miller. To the town, Arthur was a stoic architect, the man who built half the commercial district. To the unseen world of online high-stakes gambling, he was a whale being harpooned. The bank records we subpoenaed painted a picture of a man drowning on dry land. Second mortgage, maxed out credit lines, withdrawals from the daughter's college fund. Arthur wasn't just broke, he was in a hole so deep the daylight couldn't reach him. And the people he owed, they weren't the kind who sent polite letters.
They were the kind who send messages wrapped in bricks. But here is where the profile shifts. Here is where the victim narrative gets complicated. If Arthur was the chaos, Elena was the response. We found a receipt. Not in the house. The house was scrubbed clean of paper trails, but in the digital archives of a pawn shop 3 towns over. 2 weeks before the dinner that never ended, Elena Miller purchased a snub-nose .38 caliber revolver. She didn't have a license. She paid cash. When crime scene techs swept the Miller home, they cataloged everything. Every silver spoon, every toy, every book. The inventory list is 40 pages long. Do you know what wasn't on it? That revolver. The gun is missing. Now, construct the psychological architecture of that house in the final 48 hours. Picture the dinner table. You have a father sweating through his shirt, terrified that his debts have finally come knocking. You have a mother, not wringing her hands in despair, but potentially carrying a loaded weapon in her apron pocket. And between them, a child who thinks the tension is just about bad grades or a work deadline. The atmosphere in that house must have been suffocating, high pressure, volatile. And then there's the detail that keeps me up at night. The anomaly I mentioned earlier, the damp item. In the downstairs guest bathroom, a room the cleaning lady swore hadn't been used in a month, investigators found a single hand towel in the hamper. It wasn't just used, it was soaked. Not with water, but with something that smelled faintly of bleach and copper. The lab results on that towel wouldn't come back for another 48 hours, but standing there, looking at that damp cloth in a bone-dry, air-conditioned house, the realization hits you like a cold draft. The threat didn't break in. The threat was already sitting at the table. The doors were locked. The windows were sealed. The alarm system was armed and green. So, if the gun is gone and the family is gone, but the dinner is still warm, who pulled the trigger first? And more importantly, how did 3 people and a weapon vanish into thin air without tripping a single sensor? Unless, of course, the sensors were bypassed by someone who knew the code. The house was no longer a home. By the 4th hour of the investigation, the Miller residence had been transformed into a sterile grid of evidence markers and yellow tape. Upstairs, the forensic team was bagging half-eaten dinner rolls and swabbing wine glasses, trying to capture the breath of ghosts. But the real story wasn't in the dining room. It was waiting in the dark, beneath the floorboards. The basement door was the only one in the house that had been left slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough to let a sliver of hallway light bleed into the abyss below. Descending those wooden stairs felt like walking into a different timeline. While the upstairs was manicured, modern, and warm, the basement was unfinished. A skeleton of the house. Exposed beams, concrete floors, the heavy metallic smell of the furnace, and the distinct dry scent of dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. That was the first thing the lead forensic tech noted, the dust. It was a perfect gray blanket covering everything. Old boxes of Christmas decorations, a rusted exercise bike, stacks of National Geographics from the 90s. In a forensic investigation, dust is a better witness than a camera. It records every movement, every disturbance. And that's what made the discovery so jarring. At the far end of the room, near the humming furnace, the beam of a flashlight cut through the gloom and stopped. The tech signaled for the photographer. No words were spoken. They didn't need to speak. The anomaly screamed louder than any shout. There, on the raw concrete, was a footprint. It wasn't a dusty outline. It was mud. Dark, rich river clay mud. It was still damp, glistening slightly under the harsh LED lights of the forensic team. A single heavy boot print, size 12, deep tread, likely a work boot or tactical gear. The investigators immediately checked the shoes of every Miller family member. Arthur Miller wore size 10 loafers. The son, barely 12 years old, wore sneakers. This print didn't belong to them. It didn't belong to the first responders, who were all wearing standard-issue department footwear and had booties over them before entering the scene. This was an intruder. But here is where the logic of the crime scene began to fracture. The investigators traced the trajectory. If there is a footprint, there must be a path. You don't just materialize in the corner of a basement. They swept the light back toward the stairs. Nothing. The dust on the floor leading to the print was unbroken, smooth as glass. They looked for an exit. The basement had 2 small hopper windows, high up near the ceiling. Both were painted shut, sealed with layers of latex and grime that hadn't cracked in a decade. The glass was caked in spider webs that were thick and undisturbed. Then they checked the bulkhead door, the storm cellar exit that led to the backyard. It was padlocked from the inside.
The lock was rusted solid. It would have taken a bolt cutter to open it, and even then, the noise would have been deafening. So, we are left with the impossible physics of a nightmare. A stranger's heavy, muddy boot had stepped onto the concrete floor near the furnace, and then vanished. No entry trail, no exit trail, just one violent stomp of mud in a room sealed as tight as a tomb. The lead investigator knelt, getting close to the print, smelling the wet earth. It smelled like the riverbank at the edge of town, 3 miles away. The silence in the basement grew heavy, pressing against their eardrums. If the killer didn't come down the stairs, and he didn't come through the windows, and he didn't come through the storm door, then he had been waiting down here long before the Millers sat down for dinner. Or perhaps the house itself was hiding hollow spaces we hadn't found yet. The tech looked up at the ceiling, at the exposed pipes running like veins under the skin of the main floor. The investigation had just shifted from a missing persons case to something much darker. We weren't looking for someone who broke in. We were looking for someone who was already inside. And that single, wet footprint was the first sign that the Millers weren't alone in their perfect, locked home. They were living on top of a secret. In a case built on shadows and silence, witnesses are rare. In the desolation of Blackwood Creek, they are practically non-existent. But there was one pair of eyes watching the Miller house that night, eyes that belonged to Arthur Vance. Arthur lives in the only other structure for miles, a small, weathered farmhouse situated across the overgrown field, about 200 yards from the Miller estate. When investigators arrived, Arthur was already standing at the edge of his property line, hands deep in the pockets of a beige cardigan, watching the police tape flutter in the wind. He didn't look like a suspect. He looked like a concerned uncle. Soft features, graying hair, a demeanor that projected a lifetime of harmless solitude. He is the anchor of our timeline. He is the reason we know, or think we know, exactly when the clock stopped for the Miller family. According to his statement, Arthur was in his kitchen making tea at exactly 7 o'clock. He claims he looked out his window through the shifting fog and saw the warm, amber glow of the Miller's dining room. The curtains were drawn back. He described the scene with an unsettling amount of clarity. He said he saw David Miller raising a glass of wine. He saw the mother, Sarah, throwing her head back in laughter. He saw the two children passing plates. They looked happy, Arthur told the lead detective. His voice steady, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Alive, just alive. That testimony is the cornerstone of the investigation. It places the entire family, alive and unharmed, inside that locked house at 7 p.m. But as a cold case investigator, you learn to listen to the silence between the words. You learn to watch the hands, not the eyes. While Arthur recounted the tragic loss of his dear friends, there was a disconnect, a forensic anomaly in human behavior. Grief is usually messy, it's chaotic. It affects memory, making details blur and time distort. But Arthur was precise. He didn't say around dinner time. He said 7 p.m. He didn't say they seemed fine. He described the specific angle of a wine glass. His demeanor fluctuated like a flickering bulb. One moment he was wiping a dry eye, lamenting the cruelty of the world. The next, a strange calmness would wash over him, a detached serenity as he corrected an officer on the specific make and model of David Miller's car. It was the behavior of a man who had rehearsed his lines, or perhaps a man who had spent far too much time watching that house from the darkness of his own unlit kitchen. And then there is the physics of his claim. We stood where Arthur stood. We looked through his kitchen window. The distance to the Miller home is significant. On a clear night, you can see shapes, silhouettes moving against the light. But Arthur claimed to see laughter. He claimed to see expressions. On a night that the meteorological reports confirm was thick with a heavy, clinging fog. To see what Arthur claims he saw, he would have needed binoculars. Or he wasn't standing in his kitchen at all. There is a chilling reality that settles in. If Arthur is telling the truth, the Millers were enjoying a perfect family dinner just minutes before they vanished into thin air. It means the threat didn't break in. It was likely already there, waiting in the hallway, or perhaps sitting at the table with them. But if Arthur is lying or embellishing, then the timeline collapses. Before the interview ended, Arthur said something that lingers in the case file like a stain. He looked up at the darkened Miller house, shook his head, and whispered, "I always told them those windows were too big. You never know who's looking in." He offered the police a cup of coffee before he went back inside. He seemed helpful.
Friendly. But as he turned away, the light from the patrol car caught his boots. They were clean, perfectly clean. For a man who lived in the country, surrounded by mud and rain, Arthur Vance was remarkably spotless, just like the crime scene itself. In the world of forensic investigation, silence is rarely empty. It is a container waiting to be opened. And when we finally cracked open the digital silence surrounding the Miller family, what leaked out wasn't a clue. It was a nightmare. We had established the timeline.
Dinner was interrupted. The pasta was warm, the wine was breathing, and the front door was locked from the inside. By all conventional logic, the family had ceased to exist in that house by 8 p.m. The police had swept the residence at midnight. They found nothing but dust motes dancing in flashlight beams and the settling groans of a house cooling down for the night. The report stated clearly, structure empty, no signs of life. But technology doesn't care about police reports. It cares about signals. When the subpoenaed records from the service provider finally hit the detective's desk, they shattered the established reality of the case. There was a glitch in the perfect disappearance, a jagged tear in the timeline. At 2:03 a.m., 6 hours after the meal was abandoned, 2 hours after the police had cleared the scene and locked the yellow tape across the porch, Martha Miller's cell phone came alive. It wasn't a data packet update. It wasn't a background app refreshing. It was an outgoing voice call. The call lasted exactly 22 seconds. Now, in a standard missing persons case, you pray for a ping like this. A ping means a tower. A tower means a radius. A radius means a location. Usually, this is where we find the bodies dumped in a marsh, or the family car submerged in a quarry. We look for movement. We look for the flight path. But the triangulation data from the 3 nearest towers, Sector 4, Sector 7, and the repeater on the ridge, painted a picture that made the lead investigator's blood run cold. The signal strength was maximum. The latency was near zero. The phone hadn't traveled to the highway. It hadn't moved to the woods. The geometric intersection of those 3 signals pinpointed a single static location, 42 Oak Creek Lane. The call came from inside the house. Let that sink in. At 2 a.m., in a house that had been searched, cleared, and sealed by law enforcement, Martha Miller's phone dialed out. The destination number belonged to the family's landline voicemail, a call from the wife's cell to the house she was supposedly standing in. It was a loop, a desperate electronic Ouroboros. We obtained the audio file from the server. I've listened to it a dozen times. It is not the sound of a woman screaming for help. It isn't a ransom demand. The recording begins with a burst of static, followed by a wet, muffled quality, as if the microphone is being pressed against a damp cloth or inside something enclosed. For the first 10 seconds, there is only breathing. It is rhythmic, ragged, and terrified. It's the sound of someone trying to inhale without making a noise, the air catching in a throat constricted by pure primal panic. It sounds like hyperventilation controlled by the fear of death. Then, at the 14-second mark, the audio captures a background anomaly. It's faint. You have to isolate the frequency to hear it clearly over the rasp of the breathing. It's a dog barking, not a distant, ambient bark from a neighbor's yard down the road. The acoustic signature suggests proximity. It's a sharp, resonant yelp muffled by the same barrier muffling the breathing. Here is the detail that keeps detectives awake at night. The Millers did not own a dog. The house was empty. The doors were locked. The police were gone. Yet the data implies that Martha Miller was still there, in the dark, hiding in a space so tight, so overlooked, that a tactical team missed her. She was there, clutching her phone, listening to the breathing of a stranger,
or a creature, and the bark of a dog that shouldn't exist. The call ended abruptly, not because the caller hung up, but because the battery was pulled. The signal died. The house went silent again. But now we know the truth. The threat didn't break in, and the family didn't break out. At 2 a.m., the horror was still happening, sealed tight within the walls of a perfect, quiet home. Teenagers live in two worlds. There is the one they show their parents, the polished surface, the completed homework, the forced smiles across the dinner table. And then there is the world they keep locked away. In the case of 16-year-old Emily Miller, that world was bound in cracked black leather, shoved deep into the insulation behind a loose ventilation grate in her bedroom wall. When forensics finally pulled that grate off, the screws were already stripped. Someone had been taking it on and off for weeks. The room itself was a shrine to interrupted adolescence. Unfinished textbooks, a half-empty bottle of nail polish, a bed made with military precision, a detail that, in hindsight, felt staged. But the diary? The diary was a chaotic map of a mind under siege.
We didn't need a handwriting expert to see the deterioration. The entries from September were loopy, rounded, typical high school drama. But as October bled into November, the pen strokes became jagged, hard. The ink punched through the paper. The first mention of the Watcher appeared on October 12th. "I saw him again by the tree line," she wrote, "just standing there. The fog makes him look like a shadow, but I know he's looking up at my window. He doesn't move. He just waits." At first, investigators dismissed this as paranoia. The Miller house was isolated. The woods played tricks on the eyes. But 3 pages later, the fear shifts. It stops being about what is outside and starts obsessing over what is inside. October 22nd. "I heard the third step creak tonight. Dad says the house is settling, but the house doesn't breathe. I was lying in bed and I heard it. A slow, wet exhale, right outside my door." This is where the timeline gets cold. This is where the narrative shifts from a random stalker to something far more sinister. Emily notes a specific detail that chills the blood. She writes that she locks her door every night. But on the morning of the 23rd, she woke up to find her closet door ajar. Inside the closet, on the carpet, she found a small smear of mud. Not dried dirt, fresh, wet mud. The police report confirms that it hadn't rained outside for 4 days prior to the disappearance. The ground outside was hard frost. So where did the mud come from? And more importantly, how did a stranger navigate a house rigged with high-end alarms without tripping a single sensor? The diary offers a terrifying hypothesis in its final entry, scrawled just hours before the family sat down for that last dinner. "He isn't breaking in," Emily wrote, the letters barely legible. "He knows the code. He knows that if you lift the handle on the back door before you turn the lock, the chime doesn't sound. Only we know that. Only family knows that." She was being watched, yes, But she wasn't being watched through binoculars from the tree line. She was being observed through the cracks in the door frames, through the vents she tried to hide her secrets in. The realization hits you when you hold the evidence. The threat wasn't an intruder learning the layout of the house. The threat was someone who already owned the keys. The diary ends mid-sentence, but the silence it leaves behind screams louder than any confession. The monster wasn't under the bed. The monster was sitting in the living room. Human nature abhors a vacuum, especially when that vacuum is shaped like a missing family of 4. The town of Oakhaven didn't just want an answer, they wanted a villain. They needed a face to pin their nightmares on, something tangible to explain why the Miller house stood silent and empty. And they found one, convenient as a shadow, living on the periphery of polite society. His name was Elias Thorne. To the locals, he was just the drifter, a man who existed in the gray spaces between the town and the deep woods. He wore layers of grime like a second skin, and had been seen 3 days prior standing at the edge of the Millers' manicured lawn. He wasn't doing anything violent, he was just watching. But in a town gripped by hysteria, a stare is as good as a confession. The narrative wrote itself. The outsider, the savage, the intruder who smashed the perfection of the Miller family dinner. The arrest wasn't a procedure, it was a public exorcism. It happened under the harsh glare of floodlights cutting through the omnipresent fog. You could feel the collective relief of the neighborhood as they watched a confused, malnourished man being shoved into the back of a squad car. The neighbors went back to their beds, locking their doors a little less tight, convinced the boogeyman was finally in a cage. But inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere was different. It was cold, sterilized. The hum of the ventilation system was the only sound against the rhythmic tapping of a detective's pen. Elias sat there, small and trembling. He didn't look like a master criminal capable of orchestrating a locked-room vanishing act without leaving a single fingerprint. He looked like a man who hadn't eaten a warm meal in a week. The detectives pressed him. They put photos of the empty dining table in front of him, the half-eaten roast, the wine glasses still holding their crimson stains. "Where were you at 7:30 p.m.?" they demanded. "How did you get them out?" Elias mumbled, his voice cracking under the weight of accusation. He didn't have a lawyer. He didn't have an alibi. Or so it seemed. The detectives were ready to type up the confession before he even spoke it. It fit too perfectly. The dirty outsider destroying the clean, happy family. Then a junior officer knocked on the door. He didn't look triumphant. He looked sick. He held a USB drive. Evidence pulled from a gas station on the old coastal highway. The footage was grainy, black and white, flickering with static. But the timestamp in the bottom right corner was razor sharp. 7:24 p.m. There was Elias Thorne.
Not at the Miller estate, not prying open a window or terrorizing a family. He was standing at a counter, 10 miles away, counting out sticky coins to buy a pack of cigarettes and a lukewarm coffee. He looked at the camera, blinked, and shuffled out.
The silence in the precinct was heavier than the fog outside. 10 miles, on those winding, treacherous roads. In that weather? It was a 30-minute drive minimum. The window of the abduction was absolute, between 7:15 p.m. and 7:45 p.m. Physics is the only witness that cannot be intimidated, and physics declared Elias Thorne innocent. He could not be in two places at once. The implications were nauseating. The man the town had already convicted in the court of public opinion was nothing more than a convenient distraction. As they released Elias back into the cold night, the seasoned investigators felt a new kind of chill. If the dirty, unkempt drifter wasn't the monster, then the monster was something else entirely. Something cleaner, smarter. The timeline cleared the outsider, which meant only one terrifying possibility remained. The threat hadn't come from the woods. It hadn't come from the road. The danger was already there. And while the town slept soundly, thinking the case was closed, the real predator was likely watching from a window much closer to home. The pathology lab is a strange place to find the truth about a family home. It's sterile, cold. It smells of chemicals and old coffee, a sharp contrast to the warm, mahogany-paneled dining room where the Millers sat for their final Sunday dinner. We had spent weeks obsessing over the doors, the windows, the locks that were still engaged from the inside. We asked how they got out. We asked where they ran to. We were asking the wrong questions. The answer wasn't at the exits. It was on the plates. The forensic report on the leftover food came back this morning. It's a thick file, dense with chemical formulas and timestamps, but it boils down to one terrifying fact. The roast beef was clean. The vegetables were clean, but the gravy was laced with a high concentration of diazepam, mixed with a synthetic opioid. Let that sink in for a moment. This changes the entire landscape of the investigation. We were operating under the assumption of an abduction or a voluntary flight. We imagined the Millers hearing a noise, standing up in panic, perhaps being held at gunpoint. We imagined adrenaline. We imagined chaos. But science tells a different story, a quieter, darker story. Reconstruct the scene based on these toxicity levels. It wasn't chaos. It was a slow, rhythmic descent into paralysis. They sat there. They passed the plates. They laughed, maybe discussed the week ahead. And then the fog rolled in. Not the fog outside the house, that came later, but the chemical fog inside their minds. The eyelids getting heavy, the speech beginning to slur, the fork feeling like it weighed 50 pounds. The terrifying part is the dosage. It was precise, calculated. Not enough to kill instantly, but enough to incapacitate a full-grown man within 20 minutes of ingestion. This wasn't an impulse crime. This was premeditated. This was orchestrated. Someone stood in that kitchen, stirred that pot, and watched the powder dissolve, knowing exactly what would happen. And here is the detail that turns the stomach. The kitchen showed no signs of an intruder, no forced entry, no foreign fingerprints on the ladle. This implies the threat didn't break in. The threat was already there. The threat sat at the table or served the food,
and watched the Miller family fade away. Evil doesn't always kick down the door wearing a mask. Sometimes it ties an apron. Sometimes it smiles and asks if you want seconds. This explains the lack of struggle. We found no overturned chairs, no broken glass. The perfect state of the room wasn't because they left neatly. It was because they couldn't fight back. They were trapped in their own bodies. Now consider the timeline again. The neighbors reported silence. No screams. Of course there were no screams. You can't scream when your nervous system is shutting down. The timeline we built on the concept of disappearance collapses. This is now a removal. They didn't walk out of that house. They were carried. And this brings us back to that one nagging detail I mentioned earlier in the case file. The damp towel found in the laundry hamper upstairs. A single wet item in a bone-dry house. We originally thought someone took a shower. But look at the forensics. When a body is dosed with this specific cocktail of sedatives, the autonomic nervous system goes haywire before it shuts down. Profuse sweating, salivation, sickness. That towel wasn't from a shower. It was used to wipe a face, to clean up the evidence of the body reacting to the poison. The classification of this case just shifted violently. Take missing persons off the whiteboard. This is now a multiple homicide investigation. The only reason we don't have bodies is because the killer had hours. Hours of silence. Hours while the town slept under the fog. To move 4 deadweight mannequins out of a locked house. The dinner wasn't interrupted. It was finished.
The Miller family didn't vanish into thin air. They were erased right in front of their own fireplace by a hand they likely held during grace. The house was locked to keep the world out, but the monster was already locked in with them. The evidence room has a specific smell at 3 in the morning. It smells of dust, stale coffee, and the unique acidic scent of old paper. It's the smell of unfinished business. I had the Miller case file spread out across the metal desk, a mosaic of tragedy captured in glossy 8x10 prints. Most people look at crime scene photos and see the horror, the empty chairs, the half-eaten roast, the wine glasses still stained with lipstick. But a detective looks for the mundane. We look for the things that are too normal, the things that don't fit the chaos. I kept coming back to image number 42. It wasn't a gruesome shot. It was the entryway of the Miller house, the foyer. High ceilings, a polished oak floor that gleamed under the flash of the forensic camera. To the left, a ceramic stand for walking sticks and umbrellas. To the right, a mirror that reflected the empty staircase behind it. It looked perfect, too perfect. A staged set waiting for actors who would never arrive. But then, I saw the anomaly. It was small. You would miss it if you were looking for blood. But I wasn't looking for blood. I was looking for a mistake. In the ceramic stand, tucked behind a long wooden shoehorn, was a compact black folding umbrella. It wasn't wrapped tight. It was shoved in, the fabric still loose, crinkled. And the tip of it was dark. I grabbed the magnifying glass, leaning in until my nose almost touched the glossy paper. The lighting in the photo caught a reflection at the base of the stand. A small, dark pool. Water. That umbrella was wet. Not damp, not humid, wet. It had been used recently. The nylon was saturated, heavy, enough to drip onto the bottom of the ceramic container. I sat back, the leather of my chair creaking in the silence of the station. Why does a wet umbrella matter? Because of the timeline. I pulled the meteorological reports for the town of Oakhaven for that entire week. I laid the weather log right next to the photo. Monday, clear skies. Tuesday, overcast, dry. Wednesday, the day of the disappearance. The records showed a dry morning, a dry afternoon. The fog, that thick, blinding fog that Oakhaven is famous for, didn't roll in until 5 p.m. But the rain? The rain didn't start falling until 8:30 that night. Here is where the locked room theory begins to crack. The Miller family sat down for dinner at 7 o'clock. By 7:45, according to the forensic analysis of the food decay, they were already gone, vanished. The house was sealed tight, windows latched, deadbolts engaged. So, if the family disappeared at 7:45 and the rain didn't start until 8:30, who brought a wet umbrella into the house? The police arrived on the scene at 9:05, responding to a neighbor's call about the lights. They broke the door down at 9:10. The photo was taken at 9:20. The timeline was impossible. Unless the house wasn't empty when the police arrived. A chill went up my spine that had nothing to do with the station's air conditioning. I looked at the photo again. The wet umbrella wasn't evidence of the family leaving. It was evidence of someone entering. Someone walked into that house after the rain started. Someone walked in from the storm, casually, while the neighbors were already watching the windows. They didn't break in. There were no wet footprints on the floor, which means they took their shoes off. They were comfortable. They were methodical. They walked in, shook off their umbrella, placed it in the stand, and then they vanished into the depths of the house. This changes everything. We spent years thinking the threat was inside the house with the Millers during dinner. We thought it was a domestic explosion, a snap in the psyche. But this single dripping detail tells a different story. The killer didn't just strike and leave. The killer came back. Or worse, the killer was standing in the shadows of the hallway, watching the police break down the front door, knowing that in the chaos of the search, nobody would notice a wet umbrella in a dry house. The lock wasn't picked. The windows weren't smashed. The enemy had a key. And more terrifyingly, the enemy had a reason to return to the scene of the crime less than an hour after the bodies, wherever they were, had gone cold. I reached for the phone. It was time to find out who else held a set of keys to the Miller residence. Because that umbrella didn't just prove a timeline error. It proved that the monster was human enough to want to stay dry. The interrogation room has a specific smell. It's a mix of stale coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and the sour, metallic tang of nervous sweat. It's a sensory deprivation tank designed to strip away the polish of polite society. Arthur Reynolds sat there in the center of that sterile gray box, looking entirely out of place. He wasn't in cuffs. Not yet.
He was just the helpful neighbor, the man who watered the Millers' plants when they went on vacation, the man who always had a friendly wave for the mail carrier.
But in a cold case review, you learn to look past the friendly wave. You look at the hands. Arthur's hands were clasped on the table, perfectly still. Too still. A man who has nothing to hide fidgets. He checks his watch. He acts annoyed at the inconvenience. Arthur was patient. He was performing the role of the concerned citizen a little too perfectly. We brought him back because the timeline didn't sit right. It was a loose thread in a tapestry that was supposed to be flawless. We asked him to walk us through the night the Miller family vanished one more time, just for clarity. "I told you everything already," Arthur said. His voice was steady, a low baritone that sounded trustworthy. "I was watching TV. I went to bed around 10. I didn't hear a thing." "Just the atmosphere, Arthur," the detective pressed, leaning back, feigning a lack of interest. "Help us picture the night. Was it quiet? Was there traffic?" Arthur nodded, eager to be helpful. He leaned in, his eyes slightly unfocused, as if accessing a memory. "It was a rough night," he said. "The wind was howling something fierce. That storm, it was rattling my bedroom windows all night long. I remember thinking, I hope the Millers brought their patio furniture in. It was impossible to sleep with that racket." "Just the atmosphere, Arthur," the detective pressed, leaning back, feigning a lack of interest. "Help us picture the night. Was it quiet? Was there traffic?" Arthur nodded, eager to be helpful. He leaned in, his eyes slightly unfocused, as if accessing a memory. "It was a rough night," he said. "The wind was howling something fierce. That storm, it was rattling my bedroom windows all night long. I remember thinking, I hope the Millers brought their patio furniture in. It was impossible to sleep with that racket." Stop the tape right there. It's a small detail, a throwaway line meant to add texture to a lie. But here is the forensic reality. The night the Millers disappeared, the town was blanketed in a heavy, suffocating fog. Meteorological records confirm that the wind speed was less than 3 miles per hour. The air was dead. It was silent. The storm Arthur described, the one that rattled windows and howled through the eaves, didn't hit the county until 6 in the morning the following day. Arthur wasn't remembering the night of the abduction. He was remembering the morning after. He was describing the weather during the hours when he should have been waking up to a crime scene, not lying in bed listening to the wind. He was mixing up his timeline because the stress of the event had blurred the hours in his mind. But we didn't correct him. Not yet. You never interrupt a man when he is busy digging his own grave. The detective flipped a page in the file, the paper sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. Right, the storm must have been loud. He paused, looking at a crime scene photo that Arthur couldn't see. "Arthur, you mentioned earlier that it was a tragedy this happened right in the middle of dinner." "Oh, absolutely," Arthur sighed, shaking his head with practiced sorrow. "Terrible, and a waste, too. All that roast beef just sitting there, getting cold. They never even got to take a bite." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The hum of the overhead fluorescent light became a deafening buzz. The police had released the fact that the family was interrupted during dinner. That was public knowledge. But the details of the meal, the menu, that had been withheld. It was holdback evidence kept secret to weed out false confessions. The crime scene photos showed a prime rib roast, medium rare, sitting on the platter. From Arthur's house, looking through the Miller's dining room window, the view was obstructed by heavy velvet curtains that were drawn tight that night. We checked the angles. Even if the curtains were open, at that distance, through the fog, you couldn't distinguish a roast beef from a turkey or a ham. Arthur Reynolds didn't know it was roast beef because he guessed. He didn't know it because he saw it through a window. He knew what was for dinner because he was in the room. He knew because he was close enough to smell the rosemary and garlic. He knew because he heard the silverware clatter onto the china when the family looked up. In the recording, you can see the exact second Arthur realizes he has slipped. The detective doesn't say a word. He just looks up from his notes, locking eyes with the helpful neighbor. Arthur's smile falters. The corners of his mouth twitch. His eyes dart to the mirror on the wall, then back to the detective. He tries to swallow, but his throat is dry. The helpful facade cracked. The kindly neighbor dissolved, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. He had constructed an elaborate alibi, a fortress of lies built on the foundation of a quiet night in. But he had furnished that fortress with details he shouldn't have had. He remembered the storm that washed away the tire tracks the next morning. He remembered the smell of the meat as it cooled on the table while he ushered a terrified family out into the dark. One slip of the tongue regarding the weather, one overly specific detail about a Sunday dinner, that was all it took.
The lock on the mystery didn't break from the outside. It was opened from the inside by the very man who claimed he was just watching from across the street. We had him, but as we would soon discover, placing him at the scene was only the beginning. The reason why he was there, that was a darkness we weren't ready for. The warrant was executed at exactly 6 in the morning. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, just a convoy of unmarked sedans and a single forensic van rolling silently through the fog that still clung to the pavement of Arthur's quiet suburban street. The neighbors were still asleep, blissfully unaware that the monster they had been fearing wasn't a stranger lurking in the woods, but the man who waved to them every time he collected his mail. The team moved with practiced efficiency. They didn't head for the front door. They went straight to the backyard. For weeks, investigators had been bothered by a discrepancy in the property surveys. Arthur had recently undertaken a DIY project, a new concrete patio extending 12 feet from his back porch. He had told the neighbors it was for a hot tub he planned to buy for his retirement, a place to relax. But looking at it now, under the gray morning light, the concrete looked less like a renovation and more like a lid. The color was slightly off, a shade too fresh compared to the weathered foundation of the house. The sound of the jackhammers shattering the morning silence was violent. It echoed off the siding of the nearby houses, waking the neighborhood. But the officers didn't stop. They weren't just breaking stone. They were breaking the facade of the nice guy next door. Dust rose into the air, mixing with the mist. As the first layer of concrete gave way to the soil beneath, the rhythmic pounding of the machines stopped.
The heavy machinery was pulled back. Now it was time for the shovels. Then the hand trowels. Then just gloved hands brushing away the dirt. The smell hit them before they saw anything. It wasn't just the scent of damp earth. It was the sweet, cloying odor of decomposition that no amount of concrete could fully suppress. 2 feet down, the spade hit something that didn't sound like a rock. It was a dull thud. The lead forensic officer signaled for a halt. With the care of an archaeologist brushing off a fossil, he cleared the dirt from a patch of blue. It was plastic, heavy-duty, industrial-grade polyethylene, the kind you use for construction sites, or, in this case, for wrapping secrets you never intend to see the light of day. They found them stacked, not haphazardly thrown, but arranged with a chilling, calculated precision. The first bundle contained the father, then the mother, and finally the 2 children. The Miller family, still wearing the clothes they had on during that interrupted dinner. The fabric of their shirts was stained, but the plastic had preserved them in a gruesome state of suspension. The details that linked this gravesite to Arthur were undeniable. The plastic tarps were not generic. They were a specific brand, DuraShield Heavy Duty, with a distinctive weave pattern. A partial roll of this exact same tarp had been found in the corner of Arthur's garage 3 days prior. The very garage where investigators had noted the smell of bleach and a singular damp scrub brush sitting on a dry shelf. As the bodies were lifted from the earth, one by one, a silence fell over the yard that was heavier than the concrete had ever been. It wasn't just the tragedy of the death, it was the proximity. The Miller family had been here the whole time. While the town combed the woods, while the river was dragged, while volunteers put up flyers on telephone poles, they were lying right here, under the spot where Arthur had planned to sit and drink his morning coffee. The realization settled in the stomachs of the investigators like lead. This wasn't a crime of passion that ended in a panic. The depth of the hole, the perfectly poured concrete, the wrapping of the bodies, it all spoke of time. It spoke of planning. Arthur hadn't just hidden the bodies, he had entombed them in the foundation of his own life. The perfect neighbor had built his sanctuary on top of a massacre. And as the coroner zipped up the black bags, the sun finally broke through the fog, illuminating a backyard that would never be just a garden again. It was a crime scene, a graveyard, and the final piece of a puzzle that was far darker than anyone had dared to imagine. The damp item in the dry house had unraveled the lie, but the earth beneath the concrete had revealed the monster. The interrogation room at the precinct has a specific kind of silence. It's not peaceful. It is the heavy, pressurized silence of a storm waiting to break. The overhead fluorescent light hummed with a headache-inducing flicker, casting long, jagged shadows across the metal table. Sitting opposite us, Arthur didn't look like a monster. He looked like the man who watered his petunias on Sundays. He looked like the neighbor who would lend you a cup of sugar. But the friendly face is the most effective camouflage in nature. And under the glare of that interrogation lamp, the mask finally began to peel away. We had placed the financial records in front of him. The timeline was irrefutable. But it wasn't the forensic accounting that broke him. It was the suggestion that he was merely a thief. That insult to his ego was the key that unlocked the floodgates. He didn't scream. He didn't lawyer up. He just laughed, a low, dry sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "You think it was about the $7,000? Arthur asked, his voice detached, almost bored. He leaned forward, and for the first time, the kindly old neighbor persona evaporated. His eyes were cold, dead things. "Banks want money, detective. Banks send letters. I didn't want the cash. I wanted the admission. The debt the father, Mr. Miller, had been hiding wasn't from a bank or a loan shark in the city. It was a personal loan from Arthur. A friendly handshake deal made 6 months prior to cover a gambling mistake. Arthur held that secret over the father's head like a guillotine blade. It was the leverage he needed. That night, amidst the perfect dinner, the laughter, and the warmth of the hearth, Arthur hadn't broken in. He hadn't picked a lock. He had simply knocked. Mr. Miller had to open the door. He had to let the wolf in, because the wolf held the deed to his reputation. But as Arthur continued to speak, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He started talking about Mrs. Miller. He described her not as a neighbor, but as an object of worship and resentment. He knew her schedule. He knew which chair she preferred for reading. He knew she hummed when she cooked. He had been watching through the gaps in the curtains night after night from his dark living room across the street. He didn't appreciate her, Arthur hissed, his hands clenching into fists on the table. He was weak. He was a liar. He sat at the head of that table, eating that roast, playing the king in a castle I paid for. This was never a robbery. It was a displacement. Arthur was consumed by a green, rotting envy. He didn't just want his money back. He wanted the life he felt Mr. Miller had squandered. He wanted to sit at that table. He wanted the warmth. He wanted the wife. The obsession had festered in the damp isolation of his own home until it became a physical need to expose the father's failure. "I walked in," Arthur whispered, a terrifying smile creeping onto his face, and I saw the fear in his eyes. He knew I was done waiting. That was the detail that clicked everything into place. The damp rug in the entryway, the one piece of evidence that didn't fit the dry house narrative. It hadn't rained when the police arrived days later, but it was pouring the night they vanished. Arthur had walked in out of the storm, dripping wet, carrying the chill of the outside world into their sanctuary. He stood there, a dark stain on their perfect carpet, armed not just with a weapon, but with the devastating truth of the father's debt. He looked at us, his eyes wide and unblinking, devoid of remorse. "I didn't destroy their family, detective. I just revealed that it was already broken. I was doing her a favor." Envy is a deadly sin, not because it covets, but because it feels entitled to destroy what it cannot possess. Arthur felt justified. In his twisted logic, the massacre wasn't a crime, it was an eviction. And as he sat there recounting the terror of that final dinner, the hum of the precinct fridge sounded less like a machine and more like a flat line. The mystery of the locked room was solved. The lock wasn't picked. It was opened from the inside by a hand forced by shame. Friday, November 14th, 6:45 in the evening. Let's rewind the tape. Let's strip away the yellow police tape, the flashbulbs of the forensic photographers, and the layers of dust that have settled over the years. We are going back to the moment the clock started ticking toward zero. The Miller residence stands like a fortress against the fog. To the outside world, it is a sanctuary of warmth and light. Inside, the radiators are clanking softly, fighting off the chill of the damp November air. But the security system, the state of the alarm, the deadbolts, the motion sensors, they were all rendered useless by a single human error made 3 years prior. We always assume an intruder needs a crowbar or a glass cutter. We imagine the sound of shattering windows. But Arthur didn't need violence to enter. He had something far more dangerous. He had permission, or at least the ghost of it. At 6:50, a figure steps out of the shadows of the detached garage. He walks up the side path, avoiding the gravel, stepping on the soft, wet grass. He approaches the side service door. This is the first critical piece of the puzzle. The forensic report noted no forced entry, leading everyone to suspect the Millers let the killer in.
But look closer at the lock mechanism in our reconstruction. He pulls a small brass key from his pocket. 3 years ago, the Millers went on a 2-week vacation to the coast. They gave a spare key to a trusted neighbor to water the plants and feed the cat. That neighbor was Arthur. When they returned, amidst the unpacking and the jet lag, asking for the key back slipped their minds. It sat in Arthur's junk drawer for 1,000 days, a dormant invitation, until he decided to use it. The key turns. The tumbler clicks. Smooth, silent. He slips inside. He doesn't go upstairs, not yet. He moves like a phantom into the basement. This is where the timeline gets cold. This is where the damp item found in the living room, that inexplicable wet patch on the carpet, finds its origin. The basement had a leak in the foundation, a slow drip that left the concrete floor slick with mud and water. Arthur stands there, in the dark, beneath the floorboards of the kitchen. He waits. Above him, the domestic symphony begins. He hears the heavy footsteps of Mr. Miller, the lighter, rhythmic tapping of Mrs. Miller's heels, the thud of a school bag dropping. He listens to them preparing dinner. The irony is suffocating. They are locking the doors upstairs, engaging the deadbolts, believing they are sealing the danger out. In reality, they are sealing themselves in with the monster. 7:15. The family moves to the living room. The kitchen is empty. This is the window. Arthur creeps up the basement stairs.
His boots are caked with the wet clay from the cellar floor. He steps onto the pristine kitchen tile. He moves to the stove. The pot of beef stew is simmering, the lid slightly askew to let off steam. It takes 3 seconds. A small vial, a white powder that dissolves instantly in the rich, thick broth. He stirs it once with the ladle, then places the lid back on. He retreats, but not back to the basement, not yet. He hides in the pantry, a narrow closet filled with dry goods. He watches through the slats as the family returns. He watches them serve the food. He watches them eat. This is the psychology of a predator who needs control. He didn't just want them gone. He wanted to witness the extinguishing of their light. When the silence finally falls, when the toxins take hold and the panic is cut short by paralysis, Arthur steps out. The house is quiet now. The only sound is the hum of the refrigerator. Now, the final act of the magic trick, the locked room. Police found the front and back doors bolted from the inside. The chains were engaged. This physical impossibility is what turned this case into a local legend. But the answer lies in the architecture. Arthur cleans his tracks in the kitchen, but he misses that one spot of mud on the carpet near the pantry. He checks the bodies. He ensures the silence is permanent. Then he engages every lock on the ground floor. He slides the chain on the front door. He turns the deadbolt on the back. He creates the paradox. He returns to the basement. In the far corner, behind the furnace, there is an old coal chute converted into a maintenance hatch years ago. It leads out to the garden, concealed by heavy shrubbery. It locks from the outside, but can be manipulated from within if you have the right tools. And Arthur was a mechanic. He had prepared the hatch days in advance, greasing the hinges, loosening the seal. He exits through the ground like a worm surfacing. He seals the hatch behind him, weighing it down, packing dirt over the rim to make it look undisturbed. He walks away into the fog, leaving behind a sealed box containing 3 bodies and a dinner that was still warm. The house wasn't breached, it was infected. The Millers didn't vanish into thin air. They were dismantled by a man who was already inside before they even sat down to eat. But as he walked into the night, Arthur made one mistake. He thought the rain would wash away everything. He didn't account for the soil he carried from that basement, microscopic traces that would cling to the accelerator pedal of his truck. The house was silent, but the evidence was about to start screaming. The trial of Arthur Miller lasted exactly 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit courtroom, there were no theatrics, no sobbing confessions, no last-minute outbursts of remorse. When the judge read the verdict, guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder, Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He just adjusted his glasses and looked at the clock on the back wall, as if he were concerned about being late for an appointment that no longer existed. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The prosecution called him a monster. The defense called him a tragedy. But looking at him, standing there in that ill-fitting suit, he didn't look like either. He just looked like a man who had done the math, calculated the risks, and, finally, inevitably, lost. The forensic evidence was overwhelming.
That single damp hand towel, found in a dry hamper, the one detail he forgot to stage, became the thread that unraveled the entire tapestry of lies. It proved he had cleaned up after the time of death he claimed to have discovered them. It proved the timeline was a fabrication. But putting a man behind bars doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't scrub the blood from the floorboards or the memory from the town. Today, the Miller house still stands at the end of that long gravel driveway. The police tape is gone, stripped away by the wind and the rain, but the perimeter remains. It's a boundary made of silence. The lawn, once manicured to obsessive perfection by Arthur himself, is now a waist-high jungle of weeds and thistle. The white paint is peeling, curling up like dead skin, revealing the gray, rotting wood beneath. The for sale sign out front has been bleached by the sun, the realtor's face faded into a ghostly blur. No one calls. No one wants to live in a house where a family sat down for dinner and never got up. Locals say if you drive past at night, the house looks like it's holding its breath. The windows are dark, staring out like hollow eyes into the fog that never seems to leave this valley. It stands as a monument to the terrifying reality of this case. We spend our lives installing deadbolts, setting alarms, and checking cameras. We teach our children to fear the stranger in the alley, the silhouette in the window, the unknown threat lurking in the dark. But the Miller family wasn't killed by a stranger. They weren't killed by an intruder who broke down the door. The threat was already inside, sitting at the head of the table, passing the salt, smiling a father's smile. That is the true horror of the locked room mystery. It's not about how the killer got in. It's about the realization that the killer never had to break in at all. The locks were working perfectly. They were designed to keep the world out, and in doing so, they trapped the victims in with the monster. As the fog rolls in tonight, settling heavy on the roof of that abandoned home, ask yourself a question. When you go home tonight and you turn that deadbolt and you hear that satisfying click of security, who are you locking out? And, more importantly, who are you locking yourself in with? Case closed.